Welcome to the Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was Zola Jesus with Light Sick. And on today's show, I'm going to be thinking about sickness. And to quote the name of the paper that I'm going to be pulling all this information from, I'm going to be thinking about when it is socially acceptable to feel sick. And that's not just social acceptance among humans, but across the animal kingdom, because there are lots of other animals that get sick, and when they do that, they behave in many of the same ways that humans do. And so it's kind of interesting to look across all of these species and all of these individuals and think about the variation that we see, and also the flexibility in how you can respond to a sickness, and think about what that means and why it came to be, evolutionarily speaking. Now, the paper that I am pulling this information from is by Patricia Lopez and recently came out in the journal Proceedings of the Royal Society. And it actually has gotten quite a lot of popular press, which is why I decided to read it and go into a little bit more detail about what it says. So the thing that was really focused on in the press, was that there are some species in which an individual might seemingly kind of hide the fact that it's sick in order to impress a mate and make sure that it can go ahead and go forth with a reproductive effort. And of course you can see where that might be quite useful. If this is your one and only chance to breed during the breeding season and you happen to have the flu at that time, you might want to kind of pretend that you don't have the flu, or use whatever energy you have to not worry about fighting the infection, but instead getting that mate while you can, because it is really important. So the author is thinking about these sorts of trade-offs and how in some situations there might be different types of costs and benefits to engaging in sickness behaviors versus pretending that sickness isn't happening, or kind of diverting your energy elsewhere and doing something else instead. So of course this is quite a really important evolutionary thing to think about, because we've got these different costs and benefits, and that is what kind of shapes the life histories of many organisms and shapes how they display flexibility whenever they do possess it. Now, disease, as she points out, is a ubiquitous and powerful evolutionary force, to steal her words. So we know that hosts, so the animals that are being infected, have evolved lots of behavioral and physiological responses that increase their survival during infection. So for example, they might display behaviors such as lethargy, somnolence, and anorexia, which we do see quite a lot. If you've recently had the flu, you've got a really bad cold, you might have shown these very behaviors yourself. They're quite common. And historically speaking, we used to think of these things as side effects. So we used to think that there was something inherent to the pathogen that caused these behaviors to suddenly pop up in humans. So it was kind of seen just like getting a stuffy nose or feeling really queasy. It was just another one of those symptoms. But now we actually realize that these are potentially, in many cases, actually adaptive responses, where the organism that is sick chooses to engage in these behaviors. So a good example to think about this in kind of real terms is to think about maybe a time when you had some sort of a sickness and you had a really big day. So you had a really important meeting at work, or you had a really important exam at school. And so despite the fact that you were sick, you went ahead and decided to make the best of that day, and you went in and you did that thing instead of staying at home, lying in bed, having some chicken noodle soup and trying to sleep a whole lot. And that basically was your choice to say, I'm going to take this energy and put it towards that event and getting that event done, rather than taking that energy and putting it into relaxing and just trying to kind of convalesce and get better. So it's that sort of trade-off that the author is interested in. Now, all these sorts of behaviors that are considered these potentially adaptive responses, they tend to cause an overall reduction in activity. And the reason for this is that when you're kind of just low-key, then all of the energy that you would have put into mobility, catching food, preparing food, eating food, digesting it, all those other things, you can take that energy and reallocate it elsewhere. And in this case, you're probably reallocating it into your immune system so that it can mount the response that you need to get rid of that whatever in your system, to flush those toxins out, to get rid of the pathogens, and to eventually feel better. And you'll know if you've been sick that it can be incredibly draining. Even if you are not doing that much when you're ill, you can just feel like you have just not slept for weeks on end. And that is because you have to put a lot of energy into your immune system to mount that response. So if you can take energy from other activities and deploy it into the immune system, then that is going to be really helpful for you. And what's kind of interesting is that the one symptom in that list that I mentioned that doesn't quite fit in is anorexia. So this is just describing the fact that sometimes when you're ill, you just feel that you cannot possibly eat. You feel really nauseous, or you just feel like eating is the last thing you can possibly handle at a given time. And that tends to be kind of an adaptive response that a lot of animals will start to pursue whenever they've got a bacterial infection, and that food can actually fuel the bacteria just as much as it can fuel your body. So it is, in many cases, better for you to not eat at all so that you can starve the bacteria so they can't grow as well, they can't fight against your immune system, and therefore you can finally conquer them. So when an animal has to choose like this between survival and reproduction, then they should change their investment in sickness behaviors. So this kind of raises the question of when animals should experience and display sickness behaviors and when they should express them. So basically you're thinking here about the fact that you want to survive as long as you can, but if you've only got a certain opportunity in which to reproduce, you also want to take that opportunity while you can have it in order to pass on your genes. And so depending on when you get sick and what the kind of conditions are, what is really at stake, you might choose to alter your behaviors in order to maximize your overall fitness, maximize the number of genes that you can pass on to the next generation. And sometimes it might be best for you to hang in there and reproduce later, in which case you'd want to go ahead and show the sickness behaviors and allow your body time to heal. But in other times it might be much better for you to just reproduce now while you can, because the future is uncertain. You might be getting older then, you might not be any better at reproducing than you are right now, so you've got to take that chance. And if that's the case, you'd want to suppress those sickness behaviors and go ahead with the reproductive activity. So this is kind of the conundrum that the author is interested in, this fact that we might have different times at which different things are better strategies. And so you have to think about what type of behavioral plasticity is really going to be useful for a given individual and a given species, and how these different types of behaviors can help explain how animals are interacting with the other animals around them, so they're conspecifics, the other individuals of their own species, and also how those choices can then impact on fitness. And this can shed light not just on kind of the broader evolutionary scenario for these individuals, but also for potential opportunities for disease transmission, because this is going to affect whether, when, and for how long animals come into contact with sick individuals, which can have really big repercussions, both in animals and also, I should say, in non-human animals and also in humans. And this can, of course, be applied because we have both wild and captive populations in which this can be a real issue. So it's actually quite handy to get an idea of how animals may or may not suppress these behaviors at certain times, because that can have a big influence on whether they're responding to treatments, what sort of treatment we should give them, how we should keep them in captivity, whether we need to be worried about them spreading this disease elsewhere. And also, when you're thinking about humans, what sorts of medical practices should we be recommending to people of different ages and kind of different life conditions, because people at different ages and people in different settings might respond quite differently depending on kind of their particular stage in life and their particular need or lack thereof to display certain types of sickness behaviors. So let's think for a little while about the behavioral effects of infection. So let's just first of all start off by defining sickness behavior. Now I mentioned it earlier, but this is a bit more of a specific definition that the author gives. It's a reduction in a range of behaviors that are in response to an infection, and this includes food and water uptake, overall activity, engagement in social activities, exploratory behaviors, experiencing of pleasure, libido, and also how much sleep an animal will have. Now all of these patterns, these sorts of responses to sickness, have been observed in a range of different animals, including both invertebrates and vertebrates. And the vertebrates include things like amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals, including humans. So clearly this is actually a really important phenomenon that's very widespread, and therefore probably has kind of an early evolutionary basis. So this may have been something that developed quite early in animals and then was passed on, inherited by future generations, because it is a really important thing that can affect whether or not you're passing on genes and how many of those genes you are passing on. Now, as I said before, the patterns are not caused by the infection itself, but by the host organism. And this is probably mediated by the immune system and also the many chemicals that it produces. So these are things like interleukin-1, interleukin-6, tumor necrosis factor alpha, and all sorts of other cytokines. And this is important because this is the thing that signals to your body that you are ill, and so that influences what sort of behaviors you then engage in. So the immune system detects that these pathogens are in your body and that you need to mount some sort of defense against them. And so your immune system produces all of these things that have other purposes. So their purpose has to do with the immunity of your system and trying to get you better. But within organisms, those chemicals have also developed this way of being interpreted also by the other systems, so that it then cascades on and makes these animals change their behaviors in an appropriate way that can help them optimize their survival and fitness. And the reason that we know this is that we can actually induce this sort of behavior experimentally by injecting healthy animals with cytokines and also with non-pathogenic antigens, so the things that our body recognizes as little bits and pieces of things that have infected us. So we can induce this by injecting those things into animals and then seeing how they behave. This is actually quite nice because it means that we can study animals experimentally and not just wait until they happen to be ill, but actually investigate them and make predictions and then see how those predictions hold up when we actually observe these behaviors for real. So the next thing I want to think about is sickness behaviors, plasticity, and motivation. Now, I mentioned earlier that physicians have typically viewed sickness behaviors as something that happened because of the pathogen and therefore are quite a negative thing, because clearly this is something that's just being caused by the infectious agent, and so, of course, nothing that's caused by an infectious agent can be good, so it has to be bad. It's only been recently that people have said, actually, maybe these things are an adaptation that's actually quite useful, and it can help an infected individual combat the infection. And this involves a trade-off. The body only has limited resources, as I mentioned. You've got energy, you've got nutrients, you've got time, and you can either allocate those into your kind of typical maintenance behaviors, the typical things you would do as you go about your daily business, or when you're infected, you can allocate those into your immune system instead. Now, the immune responses are quite costly, and so you do have to take energy away from regular behaviors. It's not like you can just kind of eat a whole bunch more and then use all that energy to do all of the things you're doing as well as your immune system. It's such a large amount of energy that you have to put into immunity that it actually would be quite difficult for you while ill to go out and actually get all of the food you need, spend all that energy getting all of that food, and then still have enough left over to make it worthwhile because it would be enough to combat your illness. It just doesn't work out that much. So we have to think about diverting energy, which means that you're running the risk of suffering negative repercussions of having used that energy elsewhere. So maybe that means you're taking it away from growth, you're taking it away from reproductive efforts, you're taking it away from survival behaviors, so maybe looking out for predators or chasing potential predators or potential rivals off of your territory. Whatever the case might be, you are having to take that energy from those things and put them elsewhere. And given this tension, this means that there should be a point of balance where an animal can kind of maximize lifetime reproductive success by investing optimally in those sickness behaviors. So you kind of find what's the point at which you're not taking too much away from those other behaviors, you're not sinking too much into the sickness stuff, and you're kind of balancing nicely so that you have the right length of survival, the right amount of reproductive success either now or later to make that kind of energy exchange worthwhile. And animals would have to be able to use some sort of a cue to know what they should be doing at what point. And these can be environmental, and probably are in many cases environmental. So maybe they know what time of year it is, they know if it's the breeding season because of the weather or because of the sun's position, or they know that it's migration because lots of other animals are suddenly around them, or they know, something else based on what they're seeing and experiencing in the world around them, whether that has to do with abiotic things, the weather, for example, the rain patterns, or biotic things, so there's other organisms that they might be encountering. And one of the earliest studies of this theory was actually in rats, and these rats they had two groups, and one group was artificially infected with some sort of a pathogen, and one group was kept healthy. And the animals were then given several different scenarios. In one scenario, they could do something to try to get a reward. In one scenario, they could try to avoid an electrical shock. And both of these things, of course, were motivation, either positive motivation or negative motivation. And in the other scenario, they could simply rest. And what the researchers found was that animals that had been infected were more interested in resting than in doing either of the things that they should have been motivated to do. So they actually preferred to just lie there than to actively get this good thing or to actively try to avoid the bad thing. And this shows that they're potentially reorganizing their priorities. And they're reorganizing their priorities in a way that is hopefully facilitating their recovery. So instead of expending energy in either of those other two motivational scenarios, they're just lying there and keeping their energy internally so that they can work on fighting the infection. And in a laboratory setting, it might be quite easy for animals like these rats to make those decisions, but the author suggests that actually in the wild, it could be a lot more difficult to look at this because you've got so many different things going on at once that are quite hard to measure. And it might be actually very complex for animals to take in all of these things and then make choices accordingly. And as a result, it's going to be quite hard for researchers like us to be sitting here on the outside trying to measure all of these things to see which one, if any, is actually impacting the animal. So these are going to be things like maybe time of year. I keep mentioning because there's a breeding season, a migrating season, whatever the case might be. And also that could simultaneously be interacting with weather, whether it's hot or cold, whether it's rainy or not, and potentially maybe also the sex of the animal, whether you're female or male. And maybe all 3 or 4 or 5 of those things are interacting, and you have to take all of that information in and somehow balance it and decide what is the appropriate course of action. And that is likely quite a difficult thing for the animals to do, and so of course it will be a very difficult thing for us to measure from the outside as well. Welcome back to The Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was the Little Willies with Lovesick Blues. And on today's show, I am thinking about sickness behaviors and how they might change from one social context to another. So let's think a little bit about what is a social behavior and what is a social context, and why might those things affect whether or not you're displaying behaviors that kind of allow your body all of the time and energy it needs to get rid of an infection. So social behavior is a behavior that's expressed towards other individuals of your species that benefit one or more individuals in your group. And social context is the social setting in which those behaviors take place. And this can take into account things like social structures and social roles, so kind of hierarchies, for example. And these things are going to be the main determinant of the various costs and benefits that are associated with investments into different strategies. And in case you weren't around before the break, I should just remind you that the whole reason I'm thinking about this is that an author has recently written about the display of sickness behaviors in animals and why we might be flexible in which behaviors we display and when. And basically a sickness behavior is any behavior that you engage in to try to rest and spend less energy on activity so that you can then reinvest that energy in your immune function instead so that you can fight off an illness. So at different times of the year, of the season, of an animal's life, it's going to be more or less useful to engage in these sickness behaviors because there are going to be trade-offs. Sometimes it's going to be really beneficial to reinvest that energy in the immune system, and other times it's going to be much more costly because ultimately what you're trying to do is make sure that you are improving your survival and also your reproductive activity. And so you have to kind of think about how things are going and how your behaviors are going to affect those ultimate goals before you decide whether or not to engage in these behaviors. Now, one of the things that's going to be really important, quite obviously if we're thinking about passing on genes, is mating. And animals should try to choose whatever behavior is maximizing their fitness. And you can measure this in different ways. So you can think about the number of offspring that are produced, you can think about the health of those offspring, you can think about how well those offspring are going to survive. Whatever the case might be, you have to think about, as a sick individual, how your behaviors are going to make whichever one of those variables is most important to you as high as it can be. Now, in some animals, you do just want to have a really, really large number of offspring so that they are more likely to survive maybe a really hazardous environment. But in other species, you might need to make sure that you have fewer young that you invest a lot into, because that is the way that you're going to optimize survival. So there are going to be differences in which strategy is best and which of those measurements is going to best reflect kind of best mating practice, basically. Now, males and females are going to have different strategies when it comes to showing sickness behaviors in relation to mating, because they have different costs associated with reproduction. So for example, in females, there's going to be an extra burden associated with the fact that a lot of them have to carry the young, or they have to produce the egg, or make the nest, or take care of the young afterwards. So there are going to be lots of expenditures, energy expenditures and behavioral expenditures that the males don't have to deal with. And so this means you might see sex related differences in sickness behaviors that reflect the fact that there are different costs being borne by the mother and the father. And in zebra finches, there's been quite an interesting study kind of specifically looking at one particular animal in which this actually has been documented. So this is one of the things that actually was covered by the press when they read this scientific paper, because it is kind of a catchy result. And the finding is that males can mask their sickness when they're presented with a potential mate. So basically, males were artificially infected with some sort of a pathogen, and they were then exposed to different types of birds, including potential mates. And then you also had males that hadn't been infected at all that were exposed to these same things. And the males that had been infected could choose to not act ill in front of those potential mates, and they often did. But when they were exposed to individuals that weren't potential mates, they did display sickness behaviors. So this was clearly showing that the males knew that that female was a potential mate. They didn't want to blow the opportunity to potentially reproduce with her and create young, and so they suppressed those sickness behaviors and just put all of their energy into breeding here and now, because to them it was potentially more costly to not take this breeding opportunity than to hope that they got better and then could breed in the future. And this is kind of what you would expect, given that these birds don't necessarily live all of that long. They do live in kind of a harsh habitat originally, and so they were making the best of the situation while they could. Kind of carpe diem, we're going to put the energy into breeding now. And interestingly, this was exactly the opposite of what researchers had seen in mice. And so clearly there is this variation amongst different animals. And it also could be caused by differences in infectious agent. But whatever the case might be, clearly in different areas, whether it has to do with the infection or the species or the environment or whatever, there are going to be differences in which strategy works best. And something else that can drive variation among species is whether or not the animals are reproducing once, and this is known as simulparity, or whether they're reproducing multiple times, which is known as heteroparity. And you would think that an animal that's only going to be reproducing once would probably have less to lose, and so it would invest that energy into reproducing now, even if it is sick, because if you're reproducing lots of times, then you've already got a few young out there. You don't have to be so worried about an infection. But if you've only got that one shot, you don't want to waste the energy you've got into combating an illness that might actually kill you in the end. You want to make sure you get some of your genes out there. So you would expect that that would have a really big impact on this type of behavior. Another thing I kind of suggested earlier that would be quite an important determinant of sickness behaviors is whether or not organisms are engaging in parental care. So species that need to care for their young are obviously going to have to keep doing that even when they're ill. And we do see this quite often in humans. So a lot when you get a young child going off to school, being exposed to things, they bring back a sickness and it infects everyone in the family. And it's not like you can sit there and just say, oh, I'm feeling so terrible about myself, I'm just going to go take care of this, and then leave your kid to somehow suffer through alone. You have to take care of your child as well as yourself, and so often you may suppress your own desire to have a nap or to take a day off or whatever the case might be, because you simply can't do that. You do have to put your energy into your offspring. And we see a version of this in the wild as well. So there are lots of animals that even if they aren't feeling so hot themselves, they do have to keep investing that energy in fending off predators, going out to get food to bring back to the nest, sitting there keeping the animals warm, whatever it is that they need to do to make sure that their offspring are going to survive. And this is particularly common in animals where they maybe don't reproduce all that often. Each individual young is really important because they might not be able to have more later on, and so they do have to invest a lot when they can. And researchers have also demonstrated this experimentally. So they had a bunch of mice in captivity, and it's the female mice that are really taking care of the babies, and so they took some of them and artificially injected them with a pathogen. And they kept them at different temperatures. And at warm temperatures, you wouldn't expect that the females would have to do too much to create a nice warm nest because the babies don't need it so much. It's already warm. But in cold temperatures, the little pups could actually die. And so the females do need to do lots of nesting to make sure that it's properly warm and the young can survive. And they found that the sick females were suppressing their sickness behaviors in those cold conditions, and only in those cold conditions, so that they could then engage in more nesting behavior to make sure that their young weren't going to suffer. So even though they were ill and they needed to take time and energy for themselves, they didn't for the sake of their offspring. And the likelihood of demonstrating sickness behaviors may relate to the need for the offspring to have care, as I suggested, the number of offspring. So if you've got fewer, they're going to be probably easier to care for, so it might not be such a hard trade-off. Time in the reproductive cycle, so whether it's kind of early on in the season or late in the season, whether the young are quite young or whether they're a bit older, whether or not you've got biparental care, because obviously if you've got a mate and your mate is helping you care for the young, then probably you can slack a little bit and let your mate help you out. Now, another category of behavior that's most likely going to be affected or going to be a trade-off kind of situation for these sickness behaviors is agonistic interactions. So these are things where you've got two animals that are kind of fighting, basically, having some sort of a negative interaction. So maybe a territorial intrusion or kind of a social status thing. It might even be something kind of predatorial, like cannibalism, for example. Now, it's always going to benefit animals to hold good territories and to kind of defend their personal space, because this likely means that they're going to have better access to food sources, to nest sites, to mates. They're going to be experiencing fewer injuries, potentially also even have fewer opportunities for disease transmission. So there are lots of reasons why you want to make sure that you and the habitat around you is clear of any individual that you don't want around. And it can therefore be quite problematic if your sickness behaviors are reducing your ability to do any of that kind of defense stuff. And some species may reduce territorial behaviors only during certain times of year when they're not quite as necessary. So if you think about birds, often they're only really territorial in the springtime when they're breeding, and then maybe a little bit in the summer when they've got their young and their mate there. But maybe over the winter and during the autumn, it's not such a big deal because they aren't actively doing anything that requires them to have that particular location. And in fact, in song sparrows, they have shown that during the winter, they're much more likely to show sickness behaviors when they're not breeding and when they don't have to as actively defend that territory than during the breeding season. This is exactly what you would expect. And they saw this also in rhesus monkeys, but oddly, those same monkeys have also shown a propensity to spend more time with conspecifics. So even though they are defending their territory, potentially against other sorts of organisms and against conspecifics maybe that they don't like quite as much, they do also have certain mates that they're quite happy to be around, and they actually prefer to be around them more often when they're ill. And this is kind of unexplained as of yet, but could suggest that maybe they're hoping to, snuggle up to them and use their body heat for something. Maybe they want to take advantage of the fact that some of these other monkeys are bringing back food that they can then nick and eat. Maybe they are using the fact that these guys will sit there and look out for potential predators so they don't have to spend time and energy worrying about predators themselves. There are lots of reasons why actually it might be useful for them to have their friends there nearby rather than to sit there and go it alone. And all these sorts of things might be influenced by social rank, so things like hierarchies. And what's interesting about this is that those things also alone, completely, regardless of pathogens and infections, those things can influence both physiology and health. So for example, we know that a lot of stress is caused by kind of who's going to be the underdog, who's going to be the top dog, and kind of fighting and maintaining that sort of distinction within a group. And you tend to find that even though it can be stressful to be the guy on top, it's not nearly as stressful as to be the guy on the bottom who is always having to look out because he's going to be picked on all the time. So that can cause a lot of stress. Stress can weaken the immune system, and then those individuals can get sick a lot more. So there's this weird kind of cyclical thing where these things can impact sickness behaviors, but then sickness behaviors can also impact immune system, and all of that just kind of starts to interact and can become really difficult to tease apart. But one really interesting experiment, which looked at this in more detail, was to look at mice. And what they found was, so they kind of made some mice artificially ill, and then they looked at the hierarchies in existence within kind of the laboratory setting, and they looked at how this affected the display or the lack of display of sickness behaviors. And what they found was that dominant males displayed more sickness behaviors than submissive males. And this suggests that they were able to invest more in that opportunity to recover without potentially experiencing any repercussions, whereas the submissive males still needed to expend their energy on avoiding conflicts and finding safe habitat because they could always be picked on by those guys that were higher than them in the hierarchy. So there is that kind of interesting interplay with kind of the social order. And in zebra finches, there have also been some investigations of kind of social interactions and sickness. And what researchers have found is that the effects of infection varied depending on whether animals in the group were in housing together or whether they were in housing separately in the aviary. And this indicates how animals in captivity might suffer from infections in different ways. So it might be good for some of them to be around their friends, like in the rhesus monkeys, or it might actually be quite bad for them. And so you have to be aware of these species interactions so that you can either isolate an individual, if that's the better policy, or you can put it in with some friends to make it a bit better. Another thing that kind of came out of that study is that if there are these animals that want to kind of aggregate when they're not feeling so well, they're less protective of their personal space for whatever reason. This means that they potentially are going to be grouped closer together, which means that it might actually be easier to increase disease transmission. So the thing that one animal is doing to improve its own health might inadvertently spread ill health to a lot of its mates and around its tribe, and often those will be its own kin. So it's kind of ironic that here it is trying to make itself better, and in the process is maybe infecting these other individuals, and that can actually have an evolutionary impact by affecting its own related genes. So it's kind of an interesting play there again on how these social interactions can impact these different sickness behaviors. Welcome back to the Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was Chelsea Wolfe with Sick. And on today's show, I'm thinking about sickness behaviors, and this is because of a recent review article that came out in Proceedings of the Royal Society. And all before the break, I was often thinking about kind of the benefits of sickness behaviors and the different scenarios in which it would be a good idea for you to engage in these behaviors, and then what are the different impacts of various different environmental factors that might cause you to decide whether or not to actually go ahead and engage in those behaviors. Now I want to think a little bit about the costs of suppressing sickness behaviors, so deciding not to engage in those things and instead to pretend that you're not sick at all, basically. So clearly it can be adaptive for animals to exhibit these sickness behaviors because it allows them the time and energy to kind of rest and let their immune system do what it needs to do to flush out an infection and to let them get well enough that they can then go on to survive and reproduce and live happily ever after. But it also can be quite useful to decide not to engage in those behaviors at certain times. So I mentioned earlier that if there is only one reproductive event in your whole life and you happen to get sick just before it happens, and this is your one chance to pass on your genes, then you really probably would be better served to suppress those sickness behaviors. Don't go take a nap, don't stop eating, none of that bad stuff. You just kind of pretend that it's not happening, and you go out there and you try to get that mate and you try to reproduce because this is your only shot. And you've really got to make sure that you take advantage of that and pass on your genes. So clearly there are some costs to suppressing these behaviors because you could, it would be quite bad to miss a breeding opportunity, yes, but also what happens if you have lots of breeding opportunities, and so you don't have to worry about that kind of immediate concern, and you're still thinking, should I suppress this or not? Well, you are reducing your opportunity to fight an infection and also regain health. So if you decide not to rest, if you decide not to change your eating habits, then potentially you are exposing yourself to getting a worse infection, to keeping a pathogen in your system for so long that it becomes kind of a chronic problem, to all sorts of things that eventually could lead to mortality or to some sort of disability and could otherwise impair your ability to survive and pass on your genes through reproduction. And in fact, this has been observed in the field. So in both lizards and in fish that have suppressed their ability to develop a fever, researchers have observed higher mortality rates. So simply by not allowing themselves to kind of have their natural physiological response to an immune function, their physiological response of an immune function to an infection, these animals eventually ended up dying much more frequently than animals that went ahead and said, yes, I'm gonna allow my body to do what it normally does, have this fever, have the immune response that is necessary, and flush this infection out. And also, prolonged infection can lead to chronic health problems down the line. So we know that things like ticks, to use a really extreme example, if you are infected by ticks and you get some of the things that they pass on, if you have wave after wave of these just going through your system and leaving all these little microbes in your body to do these terrible things, you can eventually later on in life have some really bad infections that will have really negative long-term impacts. And so if there is some sort of an immune thing that can be mounted against something like that, then it is clearly a much better strategy to go ahead and mount that response now and get those things out than to let them stay in your system and then later on cause joint problems, memory problems, early mortality, all the things that those sorts of things can cause in humans. Now that's kind of a made-up example because actually our systems can't really flush that stuff out, but it is kind of a good example of how you can have things that over a long period of time can actually become worse and worse than they are originally. And we see lots of these things in nature, and clearly it would be a really bad experience for you to get that stuff and kind of load your body down so that you have a shorter lifespan, you have a less healthy life for whatever length it is, and you're not ultimately able to survive and reproduce as well as your conspecifics can. Now, little is known actually about these long-term costs, and that's why I don't really have a really good example for you other than kind of the tick thing, because researchers haven't really studied this yet. We're kind of at the threshold of looking at this in more detail. So it's an area that the author has identified as needing more research. Excuse me, and this is particularly true because it can have big impacts on both captive animals and human patients. And so thinking about these longer-term infections and these longer-term implications can be really important when we're trying to think of medical practices, veterinary practices, those long-lived animals that can be in captivity for many years. So what are the mediators of social modulation of sickness? We've talked about whether or not you're going to express these sickness behaviors. Now let's think about what are the things that actually allow you to make that decision, to make the connection between having an infection and choosing some sort of appropriate response. Well, behavioral expression of disease is related to three major factors. These are the immune system, the endocrine system, and the nervous system. And all three of these are influenced by the social environment. Now, the chemicals associated with these systems are likely the very things that help an animal modulate its sickness behaviors. So these include cytokines, which I mentioned earlier. These are small proteins that are involved in cell-to-cell signaling, and in this case, they're kind of regulating the inflammation and response to infection. Then there are hormones that are socially modulated and also have immunomodulatory actions, so that means that they are affecting the immune system as well. So these are things like testosterone and glucocorticoids, so steroids basically. There are also neurotransmitters, so things like acetylcholine, serotonin, dopamine, nitric oxide, all the things that are in our brain and our spinal column that are going from neuron to neuron, telling our brain to tell the rest of our system what it should be doing. And different chemicals are likely related to different situations. So it's not like there's just going to be one of these that has an impact. You might see sex differences, you might see age differences, you might see differences depending on the social scenario, the environmental conditions, and probably you've got multiple of these things interacting and having an effect at any given time. So for example, sex hormones are particularly likely to be responsible for differences that we observe in males and females, but glucocorticoids are more likely to be related to situations that are perceived as stressful by the infected animal. And if you've got stressful situations that have to do with males versus females, well then you probably have both of those things flushing through the system at the same time. So given all this kind of basic stuff that I've told you, all this background knowledge that we have, what do we need to think about looking forward in this particular field and actually finding a way to make it kind of applied and useful? Well, the types of patterns that are associated with this area of research require the expertise of lots of different types of researchers. So you've got behavioral ecology, immunology, neuroendocrinology, psychology, evolutionary biology, animal welfare, veterinary practice, medical practice in humans. So all these different sorts of people would be needed to come together and work in a kind of interdisciplinary, integrative way. And obviously that can be challenging sometimes because they don't all speak the same language. But we need to do that, and we need to do it in a way that's kind of experimental. So rather than just observing these things in the wild, which as I said can be quite hard because it is incredibly complex with lots of variables, we need to try to experimentally cause sickness in animals by injecting them with cytokines and antigens, for example, and then untangle the contributions of different multiple environmental factors. So if we start with simple experiments and then kind of layer on the more complicated stuff, hopefully we can tease out the different patterns. Now, one potential difficulty is that it might be hard to identify sick animals because if they're suppressing their sickness behaviors, then obviously it might be hard to figure out which ones are actually ill. So we need to be able to identify sickness early on and hopefully use kind of a quantitative test to reliably determine the sickness threshold, basically. So this would probably involve a blood test or some sort of other sample that would be taken from the animal so that you could say, right, this level of chemical indicates sickness, whereas this one is more normal, and then you can kind of decide using those numbers whether or not an animal is actually ill. Now, a better understanding of the social modulation of sickness behaviors could be quite useful in preventing the spread of infectious disease and determining methods of reducing infection and depression, because often illness and overall kind of lack of energy associated with these sickness behaviors is also overlapping with the sort of behaviors that we see in depression. So obviously this could be quite useful to humans. And we need to do this in kind of a comparative way, so studying the same species in different circumstances and also studying different species in the same circumstances. And then you get an idea of what are all the different factors that contribute to kind of a general behavior overall when ill, or a very specific behavior given a particular circumstance or life history characteristic or morphological characteristic, or whatever the case might be. And that might also help us unravel kind of the evolutionary history of this particular adaptation, if indeed that is what it is. So clearly we're going to need to work in this interdisciplinary way and be quite creative with our methodologies in order to really explore this further. But it is quite an interesting thing, and potentially quite useful for us to understand sickness and how it impacts both humans and other animals, and how we can actually choose to not engage in sickness behaviors, but instead choose to, let that energy go to other behaviors instead. And sometimes it is going to be beneficial to do that. You're just going to push on through, you're going to keep going, you're going to go to that meeting, you're going to take that test, you're not going to worry about the sickness. But other times you might have to take the day off and relax a bit more, have that chicken noodle soup and feel a bit better. So in addition to applying this in zoos, for example, it might help us to think, when is it really going to be beneficial to suck it up and go ahead with regular life, and when should we just say, right, I have to take a sick day today. So even if it's just as simple as giving you a nice, decisive way to choose whether or not you're going to take that leave, this would be an interesting field of research to pursue. And I will let you know if I hear about any more studies in this line of work. And with that, I'm going to leave you with At the Zoo by Simon and Garfunkel to end the day, and I will talk to you next week.